Ideological fallout. People living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers and magazine readers. I'm flying solo this week, although I have three guests that will be coming in shortly, so I am not alone. It's me, Douglas Lain, and this is the Sublation Magazine show, which is Sublation Media's weekly live stream in which we discuss news of the day with authors and some of the essays and articles that have been written for Sublation Magazine. Today, I have three guests, as I mentioned, Ted Reese, Stefan Bertram Lee, and Deep State Kuba. But before we begin, I would like to ask you all to like and subscribe and hit the bell. Also, make sure you keep up to date with Sublation Magazine's latest content by following us on Twitter and Facebook and going to sublationmag.com and reading what we have been posting. And if you like what we do a lot, you can consider supporting us on Patreon. We've just introduced annual memberships. So if you sign up as an annual Patreon supporter, you get a discount so that the first 2 months, I believe, are free. It's a 16% discount. Links are in the description. Also, if you still feel so inclined right now, you can drop a super chat, and I will be looking at the comments as we go along. We have an interesting show today. To start with, we'll be talking about the recent annexation of Ukraine by Russia and the possible consequences of that. We'll also be going over Putin's speech justifying the annexation and see to what extent Putin's claims are justifiable. Then I'll talk to Ted Reese about his recent essay for Sublation Magazine entitled Keynesianism, A Bridge to Neoliberalism. But to begin, I just want to remind everyone that Russia was recently annexed Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson by referendum that was on September 30th. I think I mispronounced every one of those oblasts. Those are that altogether that territory makes up 15% of Ukraine's 15% of Ukraine, and the move will likely intensify the conflict in Ukraine, as most of the territory now claimed by Russia is not under Russian control. This means that Ukrainian efforts to secure those regions and push Russia back will be taken as attacks on Russia herself. And there really are no limits to what Putin might do in response to attacks on Russia's sovereign territory, at least none written into Russian policy. However, rather than dwell on the intensification of the war and possibility of massive escalation, I want to bring in Stefan and Deep State Kuba if he's here. He's not here yet. But I'll bring in Stefan to talk about the ideological justifications for the conflict overall and the differences and similarities between the ideological justifications for the conflict that come out of the United States and that come out of Russia. So, Stefan, welcome back. Welcome again.
Hey.
You watched Putin's speech.
I did.
Yeah, I've read excerpts from it and Reuters, and what I saw made me think about Dugin. You know this guy Dugin and his idea about the fourth political theory, the fourth form of politics, which is neither liberal nor fascist nor communist, he says, but which is primarily aimed at overturning modernity and basically combating the West. It seemed to me that Putin's speech was very much in line with Duginism, and he justified the invasion of Ukraine not only in terms of the Ukraine's connection to Russia or the necessity to return Ukraine to the Russian territory, but also in terms of heading off Western expansion and the soul-deadening modern life that the West brings and promises.
Right. There was two kind of distinct threads going on. One of which was emphasized much more than the other, which was interesting in its own way. Kind of the four regions that were being officially annexed in the speech, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia, weren't really mentioned very much in the speech at all. Like, there was a bit on this, kind of like justifying these people as Russian, discussing because of the Soviet Union being, in Putin's words, kind of forcibly dissolved by the efforts of the West and internal traitors against the will of the people there. This kind of broke up the Russian world, and now we're kind of just putting right what went wrong there, where these people who are apparently Russians were forced out of Russia and forced out into another foreign country, which is Ukraine. But the vast majority of the speech wasn't about this. The vast majority of the speech was kind of like him being like based and kind of, you know, talking down the West and basically making like a declaration that kind of, so yeah, on that, there's kind of the lower ideological line of, yeah, we're doing that Russian expansionism, expanding into lands where there are apparently Russian people. But on the other level, as you point out, it didn't seem to really be about that at all. The point was the Ukraine now represents the West, and we represent the opposition to the West. We represent the, as he said, the global anti-colonial movement. Mm-hmm. And so by advancing into Ukraine, it's who cares about what language is spoken there or whatever stuff, or even Russia. What matters is we kind of represent an alternative to the West, while Ukraine represents a West. So each step we make, we get forward in Ukraine is a step forward for kind of the anti-Western project, whatever that is.
So Deep State Kuba has just joined us as well. I want to say congratulations to you, Kuba, on your recent wedding and marriage. It was a lovely ceremony. Thank you for turning up so soon after.
Well, thank Putin for that, right?
Yeah, right. Thank you, Putin. We've been discussing the annexation of Ukraine by Putin in Russia, and I was wanting to sort of go over the ideological justifications for the invasion itself, and then the continued escalation of the conflict. And Stefan just mentioned that Putin positions himself as an anti-West, anti-colonial crusader, saving the Ukrainian people from the West. And I mentioned that there was certainly a flavor of what I took to be Duginism in Putin's speech, and that Duginism. It's sort of surprising to me that a head of state would align himself with someone like Dugin, because he seemed to me to be such a kind of a clownish philosopher. From what I've read, a little I've read and seen of him, his philosophy is kind of incoherent. He's a traditionalist, but he's also a postmodern. The only thing that seems to give his ideas any direction or purpose is his dislike or disdain for the West, which he then equates with modernism itself. And of course, there's no real mention of capitalism, world capitalism or state capitalism in his writings or lectures. Every part of his philosophy tends to treat things as political or ideological. So like he's against fascism and Marxism or communism and liberalism, but doesn't notice how all three of those political positions operate within the context of a capitalist system. I guess bringing you in now that I've set all that up, what I would wonder is, what do you see the ideological justification being for the West to continue to arm and escalate the conflict in Ukraine, and why has there been such reluctance so far, and especially in early days, to negotiate some sort of peaceful resolution to the conflict? Why did, for instance, Boris Johnson put the kibosh to peace negotiations in a few months ago?
Well, I think that, to return to Russia, the ideological positioning of the Putin government is a symptom of the bankruptcy of the neoliberal project globally and the struggle to find any kind of alternative program for geopolitics or the international economy. Right now, the crisis of the neoliberal model is obvious more or less everywhere. The promises that were made in the 90s haven't been fulfilled. Quite the contrary. What we're seeing is greater instability, even in the core Western countries, which have benefited the most from Western-led globalization. Increased conflict, including both great powers and between regional actors within states as well. It used to be that you had a small number of failed or fragile states in an overarching world system of relatively stable countries. Now we're just accumulating on a yearly basis more conflict zones, more failed states, more regions that are essentially ungoverned by any central authority. One can think of Libya. One can think of the patchwork of sovereignty in a country like Syria, and so it's clear that the system itself is exhausted, but there is no alternative project that a particular bloc or a particular country is pioneering that others can bandwagon onto. Instead, you just have a fragmentation of power, wealth, control within this system that's buckling. Now, within that context, it's hard to find a mobilization project to justify something like a major war, which includes a national mobilization, partial still at this point, but even so, the amount of resources that Russia is dedicating to the fight, the amount of sacrifice that it's demanding from its people, requires some kind of vision, some kind of narrative to give it coherence and meaning. But all that's available beyond the neoliberal bandwagoning approach to the West, which has served Russia very poorly since the 1990s, is this belligerent opposition tied to traditional notions of nationhood, gender, religion. So Putin proposes that, betting reasonably that the resentment and fear that Russians have towards foreign influence, foreign aggression, anti-Russian security blocs will translate into the valorization of whatever is the inverse of Western demands. In this case, this kind of national conservative model. And there are plenty of fellow travelers in the West. We can think of Viktor Orban being one of the forerunners, the law and justice government in Poland, were it not strategically Russophobic, culturally Russophobic, would align with this political project, this ideological view towards tradition, religion, and old-fashioned gender identities. And you certainly see that in the United States among some elements of the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. In his speech, he mentions that within the West, there are those who agree with us, and they'll only get stronger over time. That's the groups that he's referring to. Most recently, of course, with the conservative, let's call them unreformed nationalists, and their victory in Italy. Mm-hmm. So
But the Italian president, I believe, has signed on to support Zelensky and arm Ukraine and continue that conflict massively, despite the fact that you wouldn't expect that she would do so, given her base. So it seems to me that if he's looking to Italy for allies,
the day after the election, she posted some kind of comment saying on Twitter saying like, "Oh, 100% behind Ukraine and Zelensky, whatever. We're going to give you everything." Then all the replies are from Italians being like, "You betrayed us!" Like the day after she'd been elected, as if she hadn't had constant kind of statements about she was going to do exactly this. But yeah, it's a classic thing of bourgeois democracy that every voter feels betrayed the day after.
And the no matter what the ideological orientation of an elected Italian government, it still operates within the economic, social, security contexts of the EU and NATO. If you choose to buck the foreign policy line of the Atlanticist camp, that's going to be very costly, politically, economically, otherwise. So someone like Meloni needs to pick their battles carefully. Yeah. And it could very well be that right now, Italian national finances are so fragile and have been for so long that the European Central Bank may enjoy a veto over Italian foreign policy.
Yeah, I want to bring Ted in just a moment, but before I do, Kuba, I want to ask you about the Atlanticists. I've read that there was a desire for regime change. I mean, I don't think it's really that big of a secret that there was a desire for regime change in Russia before Ukraine, before the invasion of Ukraine, and that you and I both discussed at the time, and I think it's been demonstrated more fully since the invasion started, that opportunities for a peaceful resolution were not just missed, but were thwarted. Like that was not what the United States or NATO really wanted to see in Ukraine. So, do you think it's fair to say that the West and NATO is pleased to see the invasion of Ukraine and the intensification of fighting in Ukraine continue? Is this actually the results that the NATO bloc and the Atlanticists wanted, and is the goal here regime change? And what is, if so, what's the ideological justification for that?
One thing that I'd point out in answering that question is that the transatlantic security apparatus is heterogeneous. There isn't necessarily a single program or perspective that is being implemented over time, but there are different power centers. For instance, within there's a NATO mission and a NATO program, a NATO position. There's one which is more Washington-centric and focused on the U.S. Department of Defense. There are factions within the security apparatus that see this as a dangerous sideshow, distracting attention from China. Rather than talking about a pro and anti-Russian faction, you might say that there's the Russia first and the China first side. And dedicated actors within a system can operate with some degree of independence to alter conditions that make their outcomes more likely. And I think that around Maidan, we see a great example of this. Barack Obama did not have a particular interest in destabilizing Ukraine. His position towards Russia was, we're going to have a great reset. I'm going to sit down with Vladimir, and we're going to reach some kind of a deal to de-escalate Russian Western tensions in places like Syria, across the Middle East, Ukraine. But other elements of the Western security apparatus further down and with enjoying some degree of operational autonomy, then opportunistically back the Maidan protests. And there's likely coordination internationally between the US and Poland, especially. At the time of Maidan, I considered the EU offer of closer association, that sort of 11th hour delivery of a potential path towards EU membership, as a Polish diplomatic masterstroke, because the one EU country that has such a fundamental preoccupation with Russian expansion, with keeping Russia out of Ukraine or limiting its influence there, that does have a kind of macro historical view on what needs to be done to settle the Russian question, is Poland. And they were one of the parties on the EU side of the negotiation. And I believe that this was an intensification of conflict within Ukraine, and forcing a kind of stark EU versus Russia decision on the Ukrainian government was a Polish strategy, a means to an end. That may have been a programmatic move, and one which wasn't necessarily coordinated with Brussels or Washington, D.C., certainly not at the highest levels, but Victoria Nuland and operational elements of the Polish security state and foreign policy establishment, their coordination was almost certainly taking place. So I think that talking about the bloc as a whole, we know what the ideology of neoliberalism and what their preferred global outcome looks like. It would be Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. That's how it's supposed to work. That's
yesterday.
Sorry?
Did you see his tweet yesterday?
No, what did he send?
He tweeted a prediction that the kind of worst defeat for Russia is going to happen in the next few days.
Well, there we go. The Oracle speaks, right? Somebody add an appendix to the little blue book of Atlanticism. And the reason why we're in this mess is not because this outcome was the one that was desired by policymakers in the West, but because the outcome that they desired is impossible. They're aiming for something which they can't achieve. But the ideological limitations of elites and cadres that are so fundamentally steeped in 90s vintage neoliberalism means that they have to keep at it until they reach their goal, which will be never. And instead, you'll have more conflicts, more vandalized and impoverished states, with the bien-pensant head-scratchers of Atlanticism wondering how it all went wrong, while on an operational level, you may have people like Victoria Nuland scoring touchdown after touchdown, point after point, but those not adding up to a stable world order.
I want to bring Ted in here, because hi, Ted. This is Ted Reese. He's the author of The End of Capitalism, The Thought of Heinrich Grossman. But before we started streaming, I asked Ted if he thought a better outcome, to the Cold War might have been achievable if we had not been well within the neoliberal epoch when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was a kind of hypothetical which asked something impossible because, as Ted pointed out, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union and neoliberalism were connected. But I want to reframe and ask that question now. I mean, this notion of like a Fukuyamist world where there's McDonald's in every country and therefore free and open exchange between all the different countries in the world, and conflict is at an absolute minimum, and we all just get along as the corporations.
Swimmingly.
Yeah, corporations run the world. The way I think of it is, there's a speech in the old 70s movie Network where CEO tells the news anchor, like, there are no nations anymore. There is no Russia. There is no United States. There is no East. There is no West. There's only DuPont, AT&T, ExxonMobil, and the world is run through dollars and Deutschmarks and yens, and there's a free and open exchange of money and finance that will create world peace, and our children will live in a world where every boredom is amused, every problem is overcome, and wars have ended. And that's the one version of the Atlanticist vision, I guess, or Fukuyama's vision, maybe. But I'm wondering, Ted, do you think that it was the underlying capitalist crisis that made that impossible to really achieve after the collapse of the Soviet Union? How important was neoliberalism to the political mistakes that were made as the Soviet Union collapsed, both the United States and Russia?
I mean, as you say, that is a very difficult question to answer. I mean, and as you alluded to there, I put the collapse of the Soviet Union down to the crisis of capitalism, ultimately or primarily, because it was the currency shocks as a result of the crises from the 70s onwards that forced the capitalist world to look beyond itself, to find new labor to exploit. And so there was this vast chunk of the world in China and Russia and the Soviet Union that wasn't being exploited or sufficiently exploited to raise capital accumulation. And Russia seemed to go through an acceleration of systems where Gorbachev was almost like the social democrat, making sort of left-leaning capitalist reforms, but in a socialist country, where he cut taxes, which collapsed the tax base. He made independent private production legal and that sort of thing. And then it just depended on the balance of forces, which way it was going to go in terms of, was it going to be a social democracy, a liberal democracy, or something to the further to the right of that. And that kind of depended as well on how badly production was affected in Russia, because the deeper the collapse in production, the greater the centralization of wealth, and that tends to result in something further to the right. So the severity of the collapse in production in Russia and the amount that the capitalist class were able to privatize and plunder in terms of wealth as well as property probably determined just how far to the right that outcome was.
Mm-hmm. Your essay for Sublation magazine is entitled Keynesianism, A Bridge to Neoliberalism. And in that essay, you argue that rather than being an alternative to the neoliberal order that we are living under today, that was merely kind of a bridge to that neoliberal order. Kuba, just a little while ago, mentioned that Putin can't find a political project during the collapse or destruction of neoliberalism. And I wonder, I think in the United States and the UK and maybe around the world, there are movements for what's called socialism, but which are often enough really advocating a return to a Keynesian social democratic approach. I guess I want to ask all of you, but I'll start with you, Ted. Do you think that that the social democratic turn. Well, actually, I'm not going to start with you. I'm going to start with Kuba because I know what your answer is going to be, Ted. So, Kuba, do you think that social democratic turn or a return to some kind of Bernie Sanders style or Jeremy Corbyn style social democracy, and along with Keynesianism, might have been or could still be an approach to the collapse of neoliberalism that has legs that could get that there's something more than just a continuation of Fukuyama's vision?
I think that properly understood, social democracy inhabits the same space as liberal democracy or neoliberalism, as a kind of operating system for the hardware of a capitalist economy. And on the outcomes that matter to me, human welfare, life expectancy, social equality, social harmony, it produces better outcomes. So I have no problem picking social democracy over the other flavors of capital, globalized capitalism that are available. Now, there's a reason that social democracy wasn't the model that was globalized, because the individuals that were pioneering the globalization had personal interests or ideological capture by the kind of Hayekian, Jamie Dimon, Alan Greenspan, and Francis Fukuyama ideological blueprint. And you had extraordinarily powerful actors, especially in financial services, but also in other industries, largely the management class of big firms in the United States and in certain other Western countries, that could lend their support to a neoliberal globalization, not to a social democratic one. While the forces that might have pushed a social democratic version of globalized markets, they were moribund or oppositional, frozen out of the process. To the extent that social democrats participated, it was people like Gerhard Schroeder and Tony Blair, who frankly are neoliberals that happen to belong to a party that liked red traditionally. So I think it would have been better, and it may have worked on the technical side, but the political forces at the time when the crucial decisions were being made, those were all inclined to the other side. If you had a 90s type opportunity in the 60s, then we could have potentially ended up with a global system of managed capitalism that still would have included all kinds of pathologies. I mean, no system is without its pathologies, but would have been more humane and I think more durable. But right now, I think we're beyond the point in which you just need to reprogram the hardware of the global economy with a more humane version of a more humane operating model. I think the hardware itself is broken down, and whoever comes next, and interregnums, dark ages, periods of breakdown can last a long time, where things just don't get better. You don't see much progress. But for a durable future, somebody else is going to have to build something new. There may be individual institutions and individual elements of the current system that might be useful, that might survive in some form. But if there is an order to be had, it will be a new one.
I want to give Ted now a chance to respond to what you just said, Kuba. I mean, of course, I think the last bit, what you said is something that we could all unify around, probably. But Ted, your essay, Keynesianism, A Bridge to Neoliberalism, would, to me, argue against Kuba's perspective. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't agree that Keynesianism or social democracy was durable. My argument is that after World War II, the destruction of capital during that war was so massive that, on the one hand, you had the devaluation of capital, which created this sort of new equilibrium between the two sides of capital accumulation, which is the amount of surplus value being appropriated from the working class, and that being used to essentially reproduce capital value and to expand it. So at that point, you had a new equilibrium, and you had also new technologies inherited from the war, which created a productivity boom, which started to bring about an exponential expansion in production of commodities and cheaper commodities. So people started to get better off quite rapidly, not just in the top few percent of the population, but far more widely. So you had those elements, and you had a very high demand for labour, because the rebuild was so expensive that the upfront costs weren't affordable for capital, for the private sector. So you needed the state to step in and take on responsibility for that. So all of those elements, the demand for labour made social democracy very strong. But as time wore on, the next crisis was inevitable. The system is going to go into a new crisis, because that relationship between the amount of surplus value being produced relative to the amount of capital and capital value isn't sustainable. A time will come where there isn't enough surplus value being produced, because as technology replaces labour, the relatively dwindling amount of labour being exploited becomes insufficient for that capital value to continue to expand. So when that happens, the capitalist class has to find ways of overcoming that, and one of the chief ones is privatization. So those industries that had been nationalized, in the long run, what they had been nationalized for was to cheapen production and make it more efficient for when capital needed that privatization to then take place, to take the system forward again. Because at that point of overaccumulation, the class struggle renews, and it becomes a question of socialism or capitalism again. And that can only be resolved by more capitalism, if it's going to go capitalism's way, sort of thing. Because if it doesn't go that way, then it has to go the other way.
Kuba, did you want to say something?
Yes,
It's not a static. It's not a static system.
That's true. It is not a static system, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's dynamic in the way that you describe. And I think that there are contingent elements, contingent moments that determine which track we end up on. It's not entirely determined. For instance, you describe the shortage of labor in the post-war period, especially in Europe, as one of the drivers for social democracy, which is true. That's a material condition which strengthens left-wing parties by increasing the economic bargaining power of their membership. And over time, with automation and with other economic changes, you have less of an industrial labor demand in the West. A lot of that is also has to do with just shifting production to lower value countries. So overall, you're still using a lot of labor, just doesn't all get consumed in the core countries. But over this period, there's a different corporate governance model than what emerges under neoliberalism. The kind of Keynesian management approach, where corporate leadership, even in the private sector, is situated in executive bureaucracies. The C-suite and management have more to say than shareholders. You have the libertarian Friedmanite shareholder share value revolution in order to try to break that arrangement of control over economically productive forces and reinstate it in the hands of the ownership class rather than the management class. Now, this may, from an anti-systemic perspective, may just seem like picking a new captain for the Titanic, but there are very real consequences to whatever element of the capitalist class is in charge at a given moment. Management, as opposed to the owner class, they can pivot to bandwagon with workers in order to constrain the amount of surplus that's essentially extracted by owners, by shareholders, by financial capital from the productive enterprise, and instead concentrate more of it on operations within the enterprise, R&D, even labor, even just giving more money to the union might be preferable to letting it walk out the door in the hands of a rentier class that shows up for board meetings, yells at you for not being ruthless enough, and then storms off back to their house in the country. And we don't know what it would have looked like for that management class to continue as the leaders and decision makers for economic activity in the West. Maybe it would have degenerated into something like the late Soviet Union, where you have state capitalism. Maybe because of the higher level of development in the West, you would have had a durable social democracy. Maybe it would have failed in one crisis or another. But even that failure, we don't know that it necessarily would have had to lead to neoliberalism. There are contingent choices that have to be made, and we're at the outcome of a series of elite decisions to institute this kind of neoliberal model at the expense of the old Keynesian system.
I want to interject here and set up Ted to respond, because in your piece, Ted, you say the turn to Keynesianism after World War II and before that in the U.S. during Great Depression expressed the needs of capital accumulation at a particular point in time, ultimately serving to restructure the economy in a way that made possible the ensuing turn to neoliberalism. So you seem to be saying, almost I could read in here, that the neoliberal turn was on the minds of leaders even as they implemented Keynesian spending and reforms. Like there's a good cop, bad cop dynamic between the two captains of industry or captains of capital. You have the good cops come in with the Keynesian spending and the New Deal, but all the while they also are the way in which they implement those policies sets it up so that private hands can get a hold of the resources down the line and find making profits a little bit more. Find it easier to make profits due to the New Deal policies. Is that your position, Ted?
in terms of long-term thinking, not necessarily. I mean, there were plenty of Tories in Britain that were dissatisfied and totally opposed to the nationalizations that were brought in Britain after World War II. But there were also enough of them that conceded the need to do it because they were happy to accept compensation packages. They saw the benefit of getting the state to pay for the efficiency drives and that sort of thing. Whether they thought, this is fine, we'll be able to reprivatize everything in 20 years when this period has done its job, I don't know that. But if you look at it objectively from a Marxist viewpoint, that's effectively how things played out in the long run. It cheapened production, made it more efficient, and then when you had a new overaccumulation of capital, those industries were worth reprivatizing because obviously not all of them, but a lot of them had, were just more efficient, and therefore once reprivatized, the profits would be larger than at the time of nationalization.
Yeah. You wrote about the myths of the New Deal in your piece. I want to know what you think the primary myths of the New Deal were and what the truth was.
Well, one of the big myths is that if they had carried on with it, it would have prevented World War II and fascism, and that there wasn't enough spending. Because you get half the time the argument is the New Deal ended the Depression, which isn't true. And the other half of the time is, well, the only reason it didn't end the Depression was because we didn't spend enough. And the argument is, if we had spent the same on the New Deal that we spent on World War II, we would have ended the Depression. But, my argument is that the thing that ended the Depression was World War II. That destruction of capital on that scale accelerated the devaluation that capital needed to restore that equilibrium that I was talking about before.
Like the Black Death in Europe, rebalancing the bargaining power of peasantry and labor in favor.
There's definitely some similarity there. In terms of after World War II, that Labour's bargaining power increased. But again, it was the rebuild itself made the
you had to devalue
the demand for labour higher.
You had to devalue in abstract term, in terms of money, the capital, so reinvestment could be profitable, which is not the same necessarily as what happened during the Black Death. I mean, Black Death happened before the full on commodification and capital expansion that defines our modern era. So there might be some.
I was making a shallower comparison that periods of great destruction then can lead to more favorable conditions for the rebuild. But it is if the price of getting out of the Great Depression was World War II, I don't know if we should have taken that deal.
Oh, I don't think we should have. Yeah. And I think that actually we're being offered a similar deal right now, possibly.
The options are right, nationalize everything, right, and start producing again. Produce without this imperative of profit that holds our productive base back, right? But what's actually going to happen is the capitalists are going to want to cut their costs, so they attack labour, and they introduce automation because automation doesn't fight back, or because it produces quicker. You know, so there's a oh, we could just nationalize everything, but that's not going to happen without a struggle, because the capitalists don't want that. They're sort of trapped within their own class. You know, imagine being a ruling class capitalist and turning around going, everything's going to hell. What we actually need to do, they can't do that. That's why someone would, they would be out. So that's why one of the things we say as Marxists is that socialism liberates all of humanity, and obviously that doesn't go down well with everyone on the communist left, because the ruling class is the oppressing class, and they have to be disarmed and disempowered. But it is still a reality that they are also trapped within the system. So it's sort of idealistic to say, and I'm not accusing anyone of saying this, but I'm just saying, like, we can't have a rational discussion about this on a societal level where someone like me could talk to 8 billion people and say, we can avoid World War III if we just nationalize everything.
Well, I remember there was a slogan like of the peace movement in the 1960s. What if you threw a war and nobody came? And one of the few points of any kind of optimism that I've seen is the popularity of a neo-Marxist degrowth manifesto in Japan. I think that any attempt to save the global economic order, the neoliberal order, with a new type of Keynesian World War II style organized production scheme is going to run into some real demographic bottlenecks quickly. You have old populations all across the West, Japan, I think, being particularly notable. Declining birth rates. You have a shortage of cannon fodder that you can mobilize. And also, you mentioned that if you nationalize everything, then you can sort of liberate the productive base of Western countries. And frankly, I'm pessimistic about the condition of that base. The main driver of deindustrialization has been less automation and more the offshoring of essentially global industrial production to Asia and especially to China. And what has happened is that on the downstream industries, the sort of lowest value add, most labor intensive, Western economies have shed so much that they rely, as we've seen in the case of Russia and the consequences of the sanctions imposed by the West, they rely on overseas producers for crucial basic inputs. And now we have shortages when we can't access that production in the West. And quite frankly, I don't know if left to its own devices, without access to international labor, without access to international supply chains, a country the size of the UK would be able to regenerate the essentials of an industrially productive economy. I don't think it has the human capital. I don't think it has the resource base. I don't think it has the technology. And as a result, I believe that we're very constrained to working within the global marketplace until there is a realistic plan in place for the kind of rapid redevelopment of a productive industrial base with new technologies that are less reliant on, less vulnerable to resource choke points, less energy thirsty, then having any national level plan for socialism is simply off the table. The same thing is true of some national conservative autarky dream. Like, good luck with that, right? Good luck feeding yourself off of the green fields of England when all the fertilizer is being made in Russia.
I want to give.
I mean,
Stefan,
I was arguing on a global basis, but I take your points. I mean, and you're right, offshoring has been a large part, but it's a bit of a canard. And I'm not saying that you were really saying this, but there's this sort of idea that seems to be prominent that Britain and the US don't produce anything anymore. That's just not true.
The United States certainly does.
In absolute terms, we produce more than ever.
It's a matter of the mix of production and where do the inputs come from.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
like semiconductors have massive supply chains that start with rare earth metals from China, neon gas from Russia, foundries in Taiwan, Malaysia, mainland China, Singapore, and then they arrive to be installed at factories in the US or the UK. Mm-hmm. And you can't grow a semiconductor sector overnight from available materials. And frankly, this was also part of the neoliberal model. The thing that was supposed to keep the peace in this globalized neoliberal economy was the interdependence of international supply chains, international investment. You couldn't attack any other power because you would be damaging your own productive base. This, incidentally, is the same argument that was made by Norman Angell in The Grand Delusion, published in 1914, that war in Europe is unthinkable because of all of the cross-border investment and production relationships. And to tie it back to what we were talking about originally, I think that part of the ideological disjuncture between Western neoliberals and Putin or Xi Jinping or similar figures is the question of whether the global system should be led on a business first or politics first basis. The official position of neoliberalism is like the Ned Beatty network speech. Business first, business forever, business always. That it's going to be financial and commercial elites that drive the ship, and that should drive the ship, because their practical, pragmatic profit motivation is going to keep them from doing things like starting stupid wars over the Ukraine, to which Putin said, "Hold my beer." One of the few threads that can link the anti-Western project globally, from Hungary to Russia to Latin America to China, and across all kinds of ideological divisions. And I'm not suggesting that this is like a conspiracy. I'm just pointing out that if you're going to oppose neoliberalism, then you have to have a politics first view of international relations and government policy. If you don't have one, and you are looking at it from a business first perspective, like the neoliberals and the neoliberal global institutions want you to, then you're ceding the only power that you could possibly have to discipline powerful transnational economic actors.
I want to bring Stefan in for the last comment, and then we're going to end this stream and go over to Patreon. By the way, if you want to watch the second half on Patreon, you can sign up at $8 a month and you get access to the second stream. Also, we've introduced annual membership, so you can sign up for a whole year and get a 16% discount. I'm hawking that like no tomorrow. But Stefan, the annexation of Ukraine by Putin, that's the backdrop that all of this conversation is taking place in front of. What do you think? Is it making escalation and possibly even the use of tactical nuclear weapons more likely, inevitable? Should I just relax and now because I don't have to worry about the future because there isn't going to be one? What do you think?
Well, an initial kind of plan indicated by kind of liberal Russian media, which turned out to immediately be wrong the next day, was when it became clear that the referendums were going to be organized in these regions, that after the referendums were passed, that Russia would basically say to Ukraine, you need to stop advancing, or because these regions are now in Russia, we will engage with nuclear weapons, as is in accordance with Russian nuclear doctrine. And the speculation was if this kind of nuclear gamemanship failed, then Russia would mobilize. But instead, what happened was simultaneously with starting the annexation of these regions, Russia mobilized, which, if they were planning to use nuclear weapons, doesn't really make any sense. Obviously, by mobilizing, what Russia is doing is attempting to win the war conventionally. And so, if you mobilize, and why would you use, like, the troops that have been mobilized aren't even going to be there in field until like November, or like sometime in November, probably the first of them. So why kind of, unless obviously Putin can change his mind or whatever. But I don't think there's really any indication that this is currently the plan. Though it is interesting that, at least in what they're leaking to the Western media, this threat of nuclear weapons has seemingly finally rattled the West, which obviously Russia's been trying to do throughout. They've been trying to kind of rattle and make Western policymakers afraid of kind of what they were doing and force them not to intervene. But obviously, I suppose, but this reaction to this rattling has been the West not trying to de-escalate things, but basically saying, if Russia uses nuclear weapons, we will start down the road to a global thermonuclear war. Of course, that's not what they're saying. They're saying, like, we'll do a decapitation strike on Putin, or we'll engage Russia conventionally. But of course, because Russia is so kind of outnumbered and fucked on basically a conventional level, the only way that Russia can defend itself against a conventional NATO attack is through the use of nuclear weapons. So any large-scale conventional attack on Russia by NATO it's just nuclear war, but it takes a few more days. We'd all have a lot of time to worry about it and like try and flee and whatever.
I could get a whole bunch of patrons in the door at the last few moments with some very popular, network style live streams where I'm like, we're not going to take it anymore. In 2 days' time, I'm going to blow my brains out on this live stream.
Also, you could promise the top tier patrons a space in your bunker.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. I need to build that.
And obviously, the silly thing with the other silly idea that the West has is what they're saying publicly. I don't think really serious kind of military figures are stupid enough to believe this. But that they could do not engage Russia with conventional weapons, but just kill Putin. And that would apparently solve the situation somehow. But this again relies on either they're just lying or they've kind of swallowed their own propaganda that Putin is some kind of like uniquely evil guy who's led Russia into war against the will of everyone else in the senior leadership of Russia, as opposed to the reality that Putin, as people said about Bernie Sanders in the United States, Putin's a compromise. Putin's a moderate. In Russian politics, there's guys that are way, way, way more hardcore than Putin. And the killing of Putin would obviously put them into power.
Yeah, I mean, even if it didn't, even if it put someone who we like maybe a little bit better on the surface into power, I think the annexation of Ukraine would make it impossible for anyone to, any Russian administration.
No.
The Russian constitution forbids signing over any territories of Russia.
what you do, there's a failure of imagination here.
Ted's getting angsty. He's got to go at 6 and it's 4 after.
It's all right.
Ted,
all right.
My last thought.
Let me hear this.
Okay.
My last thought. Volodymyr Zelensky, Tsar of all the Russians.
Okay.
A popular acclamation.
Listen, Ted, thank you for coming on. Kuba, of course. Stefan, of course. Thanks for being on the stream. We're going to continue on in the second hour without
wait.
Ted.
I've got Ted doesn't need to be here for this, but we have the TIR live show October 23rd in LA. And if any of your viewers want to be blackpilled in person by the likes of me and other stubble and beard bros, then
Ben Burgess is going to be there.
Absolutely. Anna Kasparian, the TIR crew.
Has Anna grown a beard? Anyway,
we're trying. I believe the science is ready.
Displayed for the first time live on stage.
The time is now. The
Very excited.
Tetragon Ballroom, Los Angeles, October 23rd. Tickets on sale.
All right, great. All right, I'm going to run the intro theme. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you in about 15 minutes or 10 minutes over on the Patreon.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military